So your worship rehearsals are too long. They're going for like 2.5 to 3 hours consistently, or maybe you're only running through 4 songs and they're taking 2 hours. Whatever it is, I think a lot of times our worship rehearsals go way too long, and the good news is that there are very specific reasons that they go for too long, and we can fix those reasons. So let's talk about some of those reasons and how to fix them. Now, before we get into things, I want to give you a free resource called the Worship Rehearsal Blueprint. You can find it linked at the top of the description below. That is a step-by-step guide that will help you shorten your worship rehearsals because you'll actually have a plan for your worship rehearsals. We're going to be talking a lot about those things in the Worship Rehearsal Blueprint. We're going to talk about them in this video, but I want to make sure that you have that to reference after this video so you can apply what you've learned. So check it out down in the description below. The first thing we have to realize is that when it comes to the length of our worship rehearsals, the fix starts before we ever show up to our rehearsals. The fix starts the week before, or maybe 2 weeks before, because your rehearsal length will be proportionate to how well you resource your team before they show up to rehearsal. So if your rehearsals are going too long, think about, what am I giving my team, and is it enough for them to be prepared when we show up at rehearsal? And I guess the reason that our rehearsals go long a lot of the times is because we're sitting there and we're working on every aspect of a song, and we're trying to help people figure out their parts and like, what guitar part do I play here? What is the keyboard part? How do I play a B minor 7 again? If your team is constantly asking those questions, then we could blame them and say you need to be more prepared, or we could understand that some of it might be our fault and we need to give them the resources that they need. Either just in general, we haven't given it to them, or we need to get it to them earlier so that they have a chance to prepare. What are some of those things that we should be giving to our team? Well, I think if you give an accurate chord sheet, if you give them an MP3 of the song in the key that you're playing in, and you give it to them at least 2 weeks in advance, then that should be enough for them to be prepared. That's at least, I mean, it all depends on the expectation that you set for people on your worship team. We'll talk about that later. But on my team, if I'm giving them an accurate chord sheet, an MP3 of the song in the key that we're playing it in, and I'm doing it 2 weeks in advance, then I expect them to be able to show up at rehearsal and play through the song, not figuring out their parts, but just figuring out how their part works with the other parts of the people in my band. And then along with that, once you've done that, then you let your team know that this is a worship rehearsal and not a worship practice. And I got an email recently from somebody asking me about what's the difference between rehearsal and practice. Well, practice is I'm going to show up and learn how to play what I need to play. Rehearsal is I already know what I'm going to play. I already know how to play it, and I'm just going to rehearse playing it with the other people around me and making sure that we're on the same page. You have a personal responsibility when you are on the worship team to learn your own part so that when we come together, we can rehearse instead of practice, so that we can run through it just like we would on a Sunday morning with minimal hiccups along the way that we have to fix, and not you saying, I don't know how to play this guitar part, so I need to figure it out real quick. That's practicing. Rehearsing is running through it with the other people in your band. Once you have resourced your team well, which by the way, if you do that appropriately, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this video, but if you do that appropriately, that will drastically cut down on your worship rehearsal time. But from there, the most practical thing that you can do to shorten your worship rehearsal time is to simply make your worship rehearsal time shorter. And here's what I mean by that. It means creating a starting time, having a starting time, and an ending time. Before people come to your rehearsal, they should already know when it's going to end. And what happens is there's a law when it comes to work. It's called Parkinson's Law, and what it states is that our work will expand to fill the time that we give it, which means if you give your team 3 hours to do a worship rehearsal, then guess what? Your worship rehearsal is going to take 3 hours. If you only give your team 2 hours, then the rehearsal will only take you 2 hours because your team will learn how to adapt to working in that 2 hour time period, which is plenty of time. I don't think that your worship rehearsal should be more than 2 hours. Of course, it depends on how many songs you're doing on Sunday, but if you're doing 4 to 5 songs, 2 hours seems pretty appropriate to me. My worship rehearsals at my church often go like an hour and a half at the most, and we do 4 songs on a Sunday. So my point is, figure out how much time you think your team needs at a rehearsal. Should not exceed more than 2 hours, say from 6 to 8, and then tell your team, we are going to go from 6 to 8. If we aren't done at 8 o'clock, then we're just going to wrap it up and we'll come back on Sunday morning and run through it real quick. And what you're going to find is maybe the first few times you do that, your team isn't going to be done by 8. But as they adapt to that 8 p.m. timeline, that 2-hour timeline, they will shape their actions to meet the required amount of time, the allotted amount of time to finish what they need to finish. So have a starting and an ending time. Now, once you have a starting and ending time and you've resourced your team well, the other hiccup that happens in our worship rehearsals that causes them to drag on and on forever is that we don't have a plan. Do you have a plan for your worship rehearsal? There should be a regular routine that you follow in your worship rehearsal, that people know what to expect. They know how long each part of the plan is, which you will find, by the way, in that worship rehearsal blueprint that I talked about earlier in this video. You can find it down in the description below. Do you know what you're doing in your worship rehearsal? Do you have a top to bottom plan? And here's just like a general plan that you could do. Let's say you're meeting from 6 to 8. People show up, you have a check-in time for 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, where you talk to people and just check in with them and see how their day's going. Sort of alongside that, you have a devotional time at the beginning of your rehearsal where you are pouring into your team spiritually. From there, you run through your songs. Takes 45 minutes, perhaps. And then you end with prayer, 15 minutes of prayer, walking around your worship space, praying over the chairs, checking in with team members, asking what prayer requests they have, what they need prayed for. And by the end of it, that's probably about an hour and a half, but you know from top to bottom what the plan is. So if you do not have a plan, make sure to check out the worship rehearsal blueprint down in the description below, and you will find even more information on what a plan can look like for your rehearsal. Now let's talk about a long-term solution to reducing the length of your worship rehearsals, and that is to build the expectations that I talked about already in this video into your process for adding new team members. That means that your new team members automatically know that when they join the worship team, the expectation is that they will get the resources that they need 2 weeks beforehand. They will get a chord chart and an MP3 in the key that you're doing it in. They will learn those parts. When they come to practice, they will already know them, and we will run through the songs as a team. That way, people who come onto your worship team, like, that is a requirement for being on the worship team. And I think that this is why sometimes some people's worship rehearsals can drag, is because we let people who play an instrument on the worship team. But being on the worship team is not just about, I know how to play an instrument, because if you know how to play guitar, but it takes you 5 weeks to learn a song on the guitar because you aren't there musically yet, guess what? You know better than anybody else because you're a worship leader. We don't really get that luxury in the worship leading space. We're pretty much learning songs maybe 2, if we're lucky, 3 weeks out from a service. For a lot of us, it's the week of that we're learning a song. And so that needs, if that is the culture of your worship team, which I think it is for many teams, and I don't think that that's that unreasonable to have 2 weeks to learn a song. If that is the culture of your worship team, make that expressly known in your worship team audition process as you're getting new people on your team. And don't give new worship team members a month to learn the songs for their audition if they're going to audition for your team. Give them the same amount of time that they would have on a Sunday morning, because that's part of what it means to be on a worship team, is that we've got to learn these songs a little bit quicker than you would if you're just doing them for fun at home. So start building these expectations that we just talked about into your new team members, and over time you will see that your team conforms to the expectations because more people will join your team and they will follow the expectations that you set. And then just a piece of encouragement that I want to give you as you think about this is that this takes time. Like, give it time, and over time, your team will adjust to the new way of doing things. It's going to be hard for the first 2 or 3 months, but over time, they will adapt to it. And I think of specifically a new team member that I added to my team recently. I worked with this person for literally like 2.5 months, I think, meeting one-on-one with her. And we were running through the songs. And during those 2.5 months, we literally worked on 5 songs, I think, over 2.5 months. That's a long time, right? But what happened was, as we ran through those 5 songs, she learned her own system for how to learn worship songs. And whenever she learned her own system for how to learn worship songs, that meant that the 6th worship song that she learned, instead of it taking her 2.5 months, it took her 2 weeks. And then the 7th worship song that she learned in a week. So give it time, and over time, people will adapt to learning what they need to learn on time. They just need to figure out their system. I've seen it work over and over again. People need to get used to the new way of doing things, and then they will adapt to it. So the takeaway for you today, if you want to shorten your worship rehearsals, is to check out the worship rehearsal blueprint down in the description below. It's a completely free PDF. It will give you a step-by-step plan for your worship rehearsals to make sure that you lead your team well, not just musically, but also spiritually, so that they can grow closer to God, and relationally, so that they can grow closer to each other as well. Check that out, and that will give you even more information on how to shorten your worship rehearsals. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.